There is a word in the Vathari language that has no direct translation into any human tongue. The closest the xenolinguists ever got was a compound phrase, something like, "the thing that should not have survived but did, and the shame of having laughed at it first." They invented that word on a Tuesday afternoon in the medical bay of the Joint Research Station Meridian 7. The reason they invented it was a man named Corporal Dale Reeves, and a scar on his forearm that 3 alien doctors had just finished laughing at. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to HFY Endurance Tales. This channel is built for one thing: stories about what human beings are actually made of. Not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized version. The real version, earned, hard, and true. If that's what you came for, hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep making these. And if this story does what I think it's going to do to you, drop a comment at the end. Tell me what hit you. I read every single one. Now, back to Corporal Dale Reeves, his forearm, and the 3 aliens who were about to have the worst day of their professional lives. Meridian 7 was not a glamorous posting. It sat in the outer band of the Verath system, far enough from the shipping lanes to be quiet, close enough to 3 inhabited worlds to matter. The station had been built 8 years earlier as a joint project between the Galactic Medical Consortium and the newly formed Human Interstellar Corps. The idea was simple on paper: share knowledge, share facilities, train together, learn each other's biology well enough that when something went wrong, and in deep space, something always went wrong, you'd know how to help instead of how to hurt. In practice, it was more complicated than that. The Vathari were the dominant species on the station. There were 12 of them assigned to the medical wing, tall, pale gray, with 4-fingered hands so precise they could suture a wound smaller than a human eyelash. They were brilliant. They knew it. And they had a habit, not unkind exactly, more reflexive, of treating the human medical staff the way a master craftsman treats an apprentice who has shown up with the wrong tools. Patient in the way that quietly implies you should be embarrassed. There were 9 humans on rotation. 6 were medical staff. 3 were support personnel, mechanics, logistics, communications. Corporal Dale Reeves was the senior comms technician, which meant he kept the station talking to the rest of the galaxy, and the rest of the galaxy kept talking back. He was 51 years old. 18 years in the Human Interstellar Corps before his knees told him that field work was finished. 6 more years in technical support because, as he'd told his daughter when she'd asked why he didn't just retire, he wasn't built for sitting still, and the stars weren't finished with him yet. He was not a remarkable-looking man. Medium height, slightly heavier than the core weight guidelines technically preferred. With gray coming in hard at his temples, and a face that had spent too many years in environments that were either too hot or too cold or too bright. He moved the way men move when they have learned to conserve energy, not slow exactly, more deliberate. Like every step was a decision that had already been made. The scar on his left forearm was 8 inches long. It ran from just below the inside of his elbow down toward his wrist in a slightly curved line that had clearly not been sutured by a professional. The tissue was raised and ridged, a little pale against the rest of his skin, with a texture that the Vathari doctors had described among themselves as crude. Not with malice, crude was simply the correct medical term. Unsophisticated healing, collagen overproduction. The kind of scar that said the wound had been closed by someone working fast, probably in the dark, possibly alone. They had noticed it on his first week at Meridian 7. Doctor. Veth, senior Vathari physician, 23 years of practice. A wall of credentials that literally glowed in the low light of the medical bay. Had asked him about it during his intake examination with the particular tone of someone who has found something beneath their standards. That's a significant wound history, she'd said. Who treated this? I did, Dale had answered. She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had written something in her notes and moved on. He hadn't thought much of it after that. He had more important things to think about. There were relay arrays to calibrate and atmospheric processors that kept developing the same fault every 17 days, and a coffee machine in the comms room that had been broken since before he'd arrived, and which nobody seemed to know how to fix except him. The laughing happened 6 weeks into his posting. It was a training session, one of the regular joint medical reviews where the human and Vathari staff were supposed to exchange knowledge. A sharing of practices, a building of mutual understanding, that was what the official documentation called it. In practice, it was usually the Vathari demonstrating how they did something with extraordinary precision, and the humans watching carefully and taking notes. That particular session was on wound closure and healing assessment. Dr. Veth was leading it. She had pulled up a series of holographic case studies on the display screen, examples of healed wounds across multiple species, color-coded by quality of recovery. The Vathari examples were at the top of the scale, the coloring deep green for optimal healing. The human examples were mostly mid-range. Then she pulled up Dale's scan from his intake examination. The scar on his left forearm appeared on the screen in full diagnostic detail. She used it as a teaching example. This, she said, gesturing at the image with her precise four-fingered hand, is an example of primitive self-administered wound closure. Note the collagen overproduction, the irregular surface texture, the suboptimal alignment of the tissue edges. The wound was survivable, but the repair quality is, by any clinical standard, poor. Two of the younger Vathari doctors made a sound that translated roughly to a gentle, professional chuckle. The human staff were quiet. Dale was sitting in the third row. He said nothing. Doctor. Veth continued. For comparative purposes, this type of scarring in a Vathari patient would indicate inadequate medical support at time of injury, likely a field situation with no qualified personnel available. In human physiology, the scarring patterns suggest the same. We can assume this individual had no access to proper treatment at the time of the original wound. She looked up from the screen. She looked directly at Dale. Is that correct, Corporal? He met her eyes. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who was hurt or angry or embarrassed. The quiet of someone who is deciding how much of the truth the room is ready to hear. Close enough, he said, and that was all he said. But Dr. Lion Cho heard it differently. Doctor. Lion Cho was the senior human physician on Meridian 7. She was 44 years old, trained at the Shanghai Medical Institute, cross-trained in xenobiology at the Kepler Station program. And she had been watching Dale Reeves for 6 weeks with the particular attention of someone who has noticed something and is waiting to understand what it means. She had seen the scar on his first day. She had looked up his file the same evening. What she found in that file had kept her awake for most of that night. After the training session ended, she waited for the room to empty. Then she walked over to Dale, who was packing up his notes with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he did everything. Can I ask you something? She said. He looked at her. The scar, she said. How did it actually happen? He was quiet again, that same measuring quiet. Then he said, Kepler 7 station, 14 years ago. You probably don't know it. She did know it. Everyone in the xenomedical field knew Kepler 7 station. They just didn't talk about it much. She said, I'd like Dr. Veth to hear the full story. Would you be willing? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'll think about it. Here is what the official record says about the Kepler 7 station incident. 14 years ago, a catastrophic pressure failure in the station's lower habitation ring led to the deaths of 9 personnel and the injury of 14 others. A structural cascade triggered by a faulty load-bearing coupling in junction block 7 caused 3 connecting corridors to depressurize over a period of approximately 40 minutes. Emergency services arrived from the nearest relay post 6 hours and 20 minutes after the initial failure. A full evacuation of the station's upper rings was completed successfully. The incident was classified as a maintenance failure. A review board was convened. Recommendations were made. New coupling standards were implemented across all stations in the network. That is what the official record says. Here is what the official record does not say. When the pressure failure began, 14 people were trapped in the lower habitation ring. The emergency bulkheads had sealed automatically, which was the correct response, and which also meant that nobody on the outside could get in, and nobody on the inside could get out. Until the pressure was equalized, which could not happen until the breach was identified and sealed, which could not happen until emergency services arrived, which was going to take 6 hours and 20 minutes. 14 people, 6 hours, dropping pressure, dropping temperature. One of the 14 was a 37-year-old comms technician named Dale Reeves. He was not the senior person in the ring. That was Dr. Ewan, the station's chief engineer, a woman of 52 with 25 years of deep space experience. She was the one who should have been making decisions. She was the one with the knowledge and the rank and the training. She was also the one who had taken a section of the coupling housing directly to the left side of her body when the failure blew. She was conscious. She was giving instructions. She was also bleeding internally in a way that Dale could see in her face even if she wasn't saying it. The 14 trapped people included 3 who were injured too severely to move, 2 who had gone into shock, 1 who was a junior technician on his second week of posting and who was not handling the situation well, and a Vathari exchange researcher named Dr. Orvith who had been visiting the station for a conference and who had, in the chaos of the first 30 minutes, tried 3 times to access the emergency systems and had been stopped each time by the fact that his hands were calibrated for Vathari interfaces, and the human emergency panels simply did not respond. To his touch, there were also 6 people who were physically unharmed. Dale was one of them, so he became the one who made decisions, not because he was the most qualified. Not because he had any formal emergency medical training beyond the standard core first aid certification that everyone carried and almost nobody ever expected to actually use, but because Dr. Ewan couldn't move without making herself worse, and because nobody else in the room was doing it. And because Dale Reeves had a specific quality that people who knew him well could not always name, but could always feel, a quality that had to do with the fact that he did not panic. Not because he was brave in the chest-out, jaw-set sense. More because, in situations where panic was the natural response, something in him went very quiet and very focused instead. He assessed the ring, temperature dropping at approximately 2 degrees every 20 minutes. Time to incapacitation from cold exposure for an adult in standard station clothing, roughly 4 to 5 hours, depending on body mass. Time to dangerous hypoxia if pressure continued dropping. Harder to calculate without instruments, but the headaches starting in the group told him they had less time than the cold was giving them. He had 4 functional people, 2 in shock, 3 critically injured, 1 junior technician who needed to be given a specific job or he was going to become a 5th problem, and 1 Vathari researcher who was calm, intelligent, and completely unable to interface with any of the human systems around him. He started with the temperature. There were emergency thermal blankets in the survival cabinet, enough for the critically injured and the people in shock. He distributed those first. Then he had the functional people move everything that could be moved, clothing, equipment, bags, anything, into a single area in the center of the ring, away from the exterior walls. And he had everyone who could move gather together. Human body heat in a confined space is not nothing. It buys time. Then he started on the pressure. He couldn't seal the breach. He didn't have the equipment, and even if he had, he didn't have the engineering knowledge to find it in a ring full of damaged panels and twisted infrastructure. But he could slow the loss. He spent 40 minutes crawling through the lower maintenance access tunnels, spaces designed for conduit routing. Not for human bodies, identifying every secondary vent and pressure leak he could find and sealing them with whatever he had available. Emergency repair tape from the survival cabinet, sections of his own clothing. His jacket, eventually, wrapped around a junction seal that was hemorrhaging pressure at a rate he couldn't live with. That was where the scar came from. The junction seal was behind a thermal panel that had partially collapsed inward. To reach it, he had to push through a gap that was too narrow for him to navigate without the collapsed edge of the panel making a decision about his forearm. He felt it happen. He kept moving. He got the seal wrapped. He came back out and used the last of the medical tape to close the wound well enough that it would stop slowing him down. Dr. Ewan watched him come back. She said, "How bad?" He said, "I'll still be useful." She said, "Good, what's next?" The oxygen. There were 3 emergency oxygen units in the ring, standard issue. Enough for 3 people for 12 hours, or 1 person for 36, or 14 people for considerably less than 6 hours if run continuously. Dale didn't run them continuously. He rationed them, 5-minute cycles for the critically injured and the shock patients, Nothing for the functional people except when the headaches got bad enough to affect judgment. He kept a mental count, he kept cycling, he also talked. This is the part that Dr. Orvith, the Vathari researcher, would remember most clearly years later when he was asked to describe what he had witnessed. He said, "The human talked to all of us, the entire time. Not commands, not updates, he talked." He told the junior technician about a posting he'd had on a station in the Kepler belt, where the coffee was so bad it had been formally classified as a morale hazard. He sat with the people in shock and asked them questions about themselves, where they were from, what they were planning to do when they got back to their home station, whether they preferred cold climate or warm. He told Dr. Ewan, who was fading in and out of consciousness in the last 2 hours, stories about his daughter. Her name was Grace. She was 11 years old and she had recently decided she wanted to be a geologist, which Dale seemed to find both completely logical and entirely hilarious. When asked why he kept talking, Dr. Orvith said, "I believe he understood something that I did not understand at the time, that the most dangerous thing in that room was not the cold or the pressure or the oxygen. It was the silence. He knew that if the room went silent, people would start calculating their own survival odds. And he knew those odds were not good enough to survive being thought about directly. So he filled the silence. He kept all 14 people alive for 5 hours and 58 minutes. Emergency services arrived 2 minutes early. All 14 survived, 3 of them including Dr. Ewan required immediate surgical intervention. She made a full recovery. Dale's arm was treated at the relay station. The medic who examined it said, with professional restraint, that the field closure he'd done on himself was not ideal. Dale had said that he was aware of that. He received a commendation that was classified at a level most people never see. He went back to work. And 14 years later, a brilliant Vathari doctor used his scar as an example of primitive, inadequate healing in a training session, and 2 of her colleagues laughed softly. And Dale said close enough, and went back to his calibration schedules. I want to stop here for just a second. If you're still with me, and I think you are, this is the kind of story that this channel exists to tell. Not the loud ones. Not the ones where someone fires a gun and the galaxy trembles. The ones where a man crawls through a maintenance tunnel in the dark and keeps talking so nobody has to think about dying. If you're not subscribed yet, right now is a good time. Hit that button, turn on notifications because we put out new stories every week, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one. And keep that comment ready, because what's about to happen in that medical bay on Meridian 7, I want to know if it hits you the way it hit me when I first heard it. Back to the story. 3 days after the training session, Dr. Lion Cho arranged a meeting. She called it a case review. She put it on the official schedule with a neutral title, Cross-Species Wound Assessment, Longitudinal Study. She requested the attendance of Dr. Veth and 2 of her senior colleagues. She asked Dale if he would be willing to come. He said yes. He brought coffee. It was the first time the coffee machine in the comms room had produced something drinkable in 3 weeks, and he seemed to feel that this was worth sharing. The Vathari doctors arrived with data pads and the particular expression of people who expect to be shown something routine. Dr. Cho asked Dale to roll up his left sleeve. He did. The scar sat there on the table between them, 8 inches of raised, ridged tissue that the Vathari medical eye classified immediately and automatically as suboptimal. Dr. Veth looked at it. She looked at Dr. Cho. She said with courtesy, "We have reviewed this during the previous session. Is there new information?" "Yes," Dr. Cho said, "there is." She pulled up the full file on the display. Not the intake scan, the complete service record, the Kepler 7 incident report, the classified commendation, the survivor accounts, including the written statement of Dr. Orvith, who had returned to his home world years ago, but who had responded to Dr. Cho's query with a message that ran to 4 full pages, and which he had apparently written without stopping. She read none of it aloud. She simply turned the display toward the Vathari doctors and gave them time. The room was quiet. Dale drank his coffee. Dr. Veth read. Her colleagues read. The particular expression of people who expect something routine changed, slowly, into something else, something that did not have a clean translation in the standard interspecies communication protocols. When Dr. Veth looked up, she looked at Dale's arm for a long moment before she looked at his face. She said, "You sutured this yourself." He said, "Taped it mostly. I didn't have sutures." She said, while the pressure was still dropping. He said, "Had to keep moving, couldn't afford to stop." She said, "And then you continued working." He said, "Somebody had to. Doctor." Veth was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Then she said something that made Dr. Cho look up from her notes. She said, "In our medical tradition, we have a classification for wound response. It runs from 1 to 7. 1 is optimal, immediate professional treatment, minimal scarring, full restoration. 7 is catastrophic, untreated wound, severe scarring, significant loss of function." She paused. She said, "Your scar by our classification system is a 5. The tissue quality, the surface irregularity, the collagen pattern, all consistent with a 5. And in our medical tradition, a 5 indicates a failure of care, inadequate support. A situation that should have been handled better." She looked at him. She said, "I used your scar as an example of a 5. I said it indicated poor healing." Dale said nothing. She said, "I was not wrong about the classification. The scar is, by our metrics, a 5. But I was wrong about what a 5 means." She set down her data pad. She said, "In our physiology, in our history, in our entire medical tradition, a 5 means something went wrong. Someone failed. The system failed. There was a lack." She paused again. She said, "In your case, a 5 means you kept 13 other people alive for 6 hours in a failing environment while managing an open wound with field materials, and when emergency services arrived." Everyone was breathing. The room was very quiet. Dale put down his coffee cup. He said, 14. There were 14 of us. Dr. Veth looked at him. He said, "I was one of the 14. Everybody made it." She held his gaze. Then she said, and this was the part that Dr. Cho would remember for the rest of her career. She said, "In our language, we do not have a word for this, for what your scar represents. For the category of wound that is not a failure but an endurance. A wound sustained in the act of preventing something worse. A mark that indicates not that something went wrong, but that someone kept going when going was not the reasonable option." She paused. She said, "We will need to make one. What happened next is not in any official record. It is in Dr. Orvith's letter, in a single paragraph near the end that Dr. Cho read so many times she eventually had it memorized. He wrote, "I have thought often about those 6 hours, about the cold and the counting, and the sound of his voice in the dark filling the space so we didn't have to fill it with our own fear. I have thought about the moment when I understood what he was doing, not just the oxygen management and the pressure sealing, which were impressive enough, but the talking. The deliberate, endless, personal talking. He was not keeping us distracted. He was keeping us human, keeping us present, keeping us in a story that was still going. Because a person in a story that is still going does not decide that the story is over." He wrote, "I have been a researcher for 30 years. I have studied 14 species. I have attended more conferences and written more papers than I can accurately count. And I have learned, in that time, that knowledge is not the same as understanding. I knew before Kepler 7 that humans were a resilient species. I knew the clinical data. I knew the evolutionary history, the Deathworld classification, the physiological redundancies that made them difficult to kill." He wrote, "What I did not know, what I did not understand. Until a man with an open wound on his arm told my colleague stories about his daughter's interest in geology while I sat in the dark and tried to breathe slowly, was that human resilience is not primarily a physical quality." He wrote, "It is a decision, made over and over again in the dark when nobody is watching and there is no reason to keep going except that you have decided to keep going. And somehow, and this is the part I cannot fully explain, even now, somehow that decision is contagious. He decided to keep going, and so I kept going, and so we all kept going. Not because the situation had changed, because he kept choosing to be in it, and he kept inviting us to be in it with him, and none of us wanted to be the one to say no." The word the Vathari made took 3 months to finalize. Linguistic innovation in a species with a 4,000-year recorded medical tradition is not fast. There were committees. There were debates. There were at least 2 formal objections filed by senior members of the Medical Linguistics Council who felt that existing terminology was sufficient and that creating new vocabulary for a human case. Study set a precedent they were not comfortable with. Dr. Veth overruled them. She had, apparently, a significant amount of professional capital accumulated over 23 years of practice, and she spent a meaningful portion of it on this. The word they created, and this does not transliterate neatly into English, so bear with the approximation, was something like Vareth Asen. The first part, Vareth, came from their root word for scar tissue, specifically the kind that forms when a wound has fully closed and the body has moved on. The second part, Asen, was older. It appeared in Vathari literature going back to the earliest written records, in poetry, in ceremonial language, in the oldest of their healing texts. It was a word that had always meant, roughly, the quality of continuing past the point where stopping would have been forgiven. Together, Vareth Asen. The scar of continuing past where stopping would have been forgiven. It entered the Vathari medical lexicon as a new category, not a failure of healing, not a success of healing, but a third thing entirely. Evidence of a wound that was survived not despite the circumstances, but alongside them, while something else was being kept alive. Dale Reeves was listed in the accompanying case documentation simply as human male, Corporal Kepler 7 Station. Age at incident, 37. Dr. Cho sent him a copy of the final lexicon entry. He read it in the comms room between a relay calibration and a diagnostic cycle on the atmospheric processor. She found him there an hour later. She said, "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Seems like a lot of trouble for one scar." She said, "It's not about the scar." He looked at her. She said, "It's about the category." They didn't have a way to see it before. Now they do. He thought about this. He said 14 years to get a proper diagnosis. She laughed. He said, "I'm going to get that coffee machine working again. You want a cup when it's ready?" She said yes. He went back to work. On his last day at Meridian 7, his rotation ended 8 months after the training session. Dr. Veth came to find him in the comms room. She came alone, which was unusual. She was carrying a small object in one of her precise four-fingered hands, a flat disk of some material Dale didn't recognize, pale and slightly translucent, about the size of a human palm. She held it out to him. He looked at it. She said, "It is a Vathari healing record, traditionally given between physicians when a case has changed the way they practice. But there is no equivalent tradition for giving one to a patient." She paused. She said, "I am starting one." He took the disc. He turned it over in his hands. It was warm, slightly. He didn't know if that was the material or just because she'd been holding it. He said, "I'm not a physician." She said, "No. But you kept 14 people alive in a failing environment with a field dressing and a story about a girl who wanted to be a geologist. I think the category is flexible." He looked at her. She said, "I used your scar as an example of inadequate healing. I would like to apologize for that formally on behalf of my department." He said, "You didn't know what it was." She said, "That is precisely why I am apologizing. I made a judgment about what I did not understand. In medicine, that is one of the more serious things you can do." He thought about that. He said, "Well, now you've got a word for it." She said, "Now we have a word for it." He put the disc in his shirt pocket. He said, "I'll take care of it." She said, "I know." Dale Reeves retired from the Human Interstellar Corps 3 years later. He moved back to the same town in Central Oregon where he'd grown up, a place with more sky than most people know what to do with, and winters that would freeze the ambition right out of you if you let them, and a daughter named Grace who had, by then, completed her first year of graduate work in planetary geology, and who had very strong opinions about igneous rock formations that she shared at length every Sunday dinner. The Vathari healing disc sat on a shelf in his study. He didn't display it prominently. It wasn't that kind of man, and it wasn't that kind of object. It just sat there, next to a photograph of Kepler 7 station that someone had sent him years ago, and a coffee mug from Meridian 7 that he'd accidentally packed when he left, and a small framed piece of paper that said only, "Vareth Asen with Dr. Veth's careful handwriting below it translating the phrase into English. The scar of continuing past where stopping would have been forgiven. His daughter asked him about it once. He told her it was a medical term. She said it sounded like more than that. He looked at the shelf for a moment. He said, "It means a wound that was worth it." She thought about that. She said, "Is it?" He said 14 people went home that day. Yeah, it was worth it. She didn't say anything after that. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much to say, and some things are better honored by the quiet than by the words. He poured them both more coffee. They sat with the Oregon sky going dark outside the window, and the stars coming up one by one the way they always do, patient, indifferent, and utterly indifferent to whether you noticed them or not. Dale noticed them. He always had. That's the story of Dale Reeves and the scar that a species of brilliant alien physicians didn't have a word for until they met him. That's what this channel is. Not the loudest stories, the truest ones, the ones about what it actually costs to keep going and what it's worth when you do. If this one got you, and I think it did, leave a comment below. Tell me what hit you hardest. Was it the 6 hours in the dark? Was it the talking? Was it Dr. Veth standing in the comms room holding that disc? I read every comment, every single one. And the conversations that happen down there are some of the best I've ever been part of. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. We're putting out a new story every week, and the next one, I'll just say this. The next one is about a human translator who was told she was the least important person in a peace negotiation. She kept that opinion to herself for about 4 days. I'm your narrator. This has been HFY Endurance Tales. Thank you for listening. And thank you genuinely for being the kind of person who stayed all the way to the end. That's its own kind of Vareth Asen if you think about it. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon.